Islam and freedom. Thank you, Dr. Ahmad.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, please allow me to begin with the traditional Islamic greeting. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Well, I want to begin, because of the audience that I have, and because of the talk I'm giving about Islam and liberty, I'm going to make a lot of arguments about why Islam is favorable to liberty. And as I do so, it'll bring the question, I'm sure, in the minds of many of you, that's not what I see when I look at the Muslim world. So let me begin by pointing out an analogy between the Quran, which for Muslims is the Word of God, literally the Word of God, it's revelation to mankind, to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the U.S. Constitution, and ask you to think in your own mind, given what an excellent document the U.S. Constitution is, why we have the problems we confront, not only in the state legislatures, in the Congress, but unfortunately even in the minds of our fellow citizens as to what they think the purpose and limits of government are. And if you bear that in mind, it may suggest to you some of the answers to the questions that will arise in the course of my discussion. Now, I'm going to begin with a brief discussion of Islamic theology. I know you didn't come here to hear theology, but one has to bear in mind that in Islam everything is rooted in the theology. But fortunately, the Islamic theology is very simple, so this will not take long at all. The definition of a Muslim is someone who believes that there is no God but God, the God of Abraham, and that Muhammad is his messenger. There's only two parts to the declaration of the faith. And anyone who says this, knowing what it means and believing it, is by definition a Muslim. Now the first part of this, there is no God but God, which in Arabic the name is Allah, but Allah is just the name of the God of Abraham. In Arabic, it's Christians and Jews who are Arab speakers also refer to God as Allah. Although, unfortunately, if you follow the news, some non-Arab speakers are very confused about this issue, including Muslims, like in Malaysia, where the Malaysian Sultan just made a ruling that non-Muslims are not allowed to use the name Allah in referring to God. So it's not just Islamophobes who are confused on this. It's other non-Arab speakers who don't understand what the word means. Anyway, there is no God but God is the foundation of everything in Islam. The concept of tawheed, oneness, unity of God. And if there is really no God but God, what does that mean? And I don't have a blackboard here, but if I were to write it, I would write it, there is no God with a small g, but God with a capital G. Because the Arabic words are different words. La ilaha illallah. Ilaha means anything that is worshipped. And Allah means the God of Abraham. So there is nothing worthy of worship except the God of Abraham, is what it's really saying. And what does that mean? What are the things that we worship? Well, when you think about not only the literal but the metaphorical use of the term worship, right? Lovers who say, oh, I worship her. To love something, to adore something so intensely that you become its willing slave. You would do anything for that which you worship. And in fact, in Arabic, the word worship comes from the same root as the word adore. Abdu. And also, the word for servant or slave comes from the same root. So you see, it's all tied together. What is it you're going to give yourself over to completely and totally submit to? And the word Islam means submission. So what is it you're going to submit to? If you believe La ilaha illallah, you will not submit to anything except the one God, the creator of all things. And that means that everything else is not to be worshipped. And here's, when we get into the political realm, that means including the state. Like any other human invention, like let's say guns, the state can be useful and positive, but it can also be very negative. In fact, George Washington made the comparison of the state to fire. Another human invention, a very old one, probably older than the state. But he said of the state, like fire, is a dangerous servant and a terrible master. So, the state has to be put in its place. It has to be devoted to the service of the broader purpose of man on earth. And what is that purpose? It is what Muslims call, what the Quran calls the Khalifa. Now you will hear the word Khalifa used by Muslims, by historians, as referring to the head of the Muslim state. But that's not the way the Quran uses the word. The Quran uses the word to refer to human beings. Every individual, male and female human being, is the Khalifa. In other words, our purpose on earth is to do God's will, to serve God. But how do you serve God? Well, that's a tricky one because God doesn't need anything from us. So our method of serving God is to serve mankind. And it'll be about how one goes about doing that will be the substance of my discussion. But having discussed now what it means to say that you believe there is no God but God with a capital G, what does it mean to say you believe Muhammad is the messenger of God? It does not mean that you believe Muhammad is the only messenger of God. Quite to the contrary. Islam is an Abrahamic faith. Like Christianity and Judaism, it believes in all of the prophets of the Old Testament. Plus, Islam believes in the prophets of the New Testament, John the Baptist, and Jesus Christ himself, peace upon all of them. And Muslims also believe in the prophet Muhammad as the last of the prophets. For the Muslims, all the prophets, in fact, the prophet Muhammad said that the Quran says that the Muslims are those who make no distinctions among the prophets. And this leads to an interesting incident in the prophet's life. The sources of Islamic law ultimately are the Quran, obviously, but also the Hadith, which are the sayings of the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there's a Hadith that reports, the word Hadith just means report. There's a Hadith that reports that one time the prophet saw a Muslim arguing with a Jew about whether Moses or Muhammad is a greater prophet. And Muhammad chastised the Muslim and said, don't get into arguments like this. And reminded him that the Quran says that Muslims will make no distinctions among the prophets. And the Muslim said, yeah, the Quran says we make no distinction among the prophets, but the Quran also says that you are the seal of the prophets. Isn't that a distinction? Now, what Muslims believe the phrase seal of the prophets means is two things, because when you seal a letter, you do two things. Number one, you authenticate the contents, saying, this, I really sent this letter. And so when we say Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, one of the things we mean is that he is authenticating all the prophets that came before him. Say, yes, they are all real prophets. But the other thing you do when you seal a letter is you close it. Nothing's going to be added now. It's finished. And so Muslims also believe that the Quran is the final revelation to mankind, and there will be no further revelation. One of the implications of that is that now that there is no direct revelation, from now on we have to use this in order to answer the problems that arise before us, the human mind. And there's another hadith in which the Prophet said, the scholars are the heirs of the prophets. So the Prophet said, so when the man said, well, isn't the seal of the prophets a distinction? The Prophet said, my position in the brotherhood of prophets is as if someone had built a house out of identical bricks, but there was a brick missing. And people would come and they say, this will be a beautiful house, but there's a brick missing. And then the designer puts one last brick in place, and people say, ah, now the house is completed. He said, I am that last brick. So, as I said, Muslims have developed their legal system by looking to those sources primarily, along with a couple of others that I'll mention later. But these are the primary sources, the Quran, obviously, and the practice of the Prophet. For the Quran says of the Prophet's behavior, you have an example for you in the practice of the Prophet. So we look at the Prophet practice as an example. Now, what does the Quran say? Well, the Quran does not have, contrary to what you may have heard, the impression you may be given, it doesn't have a lot of legal dicta. It has a few, but basically a handful. For the most part, what the Quran has is principles that govern human behavior. And when we look and say, well, are there any political principles in the Quran? The one that jumps out at me as a almost lifelong libertarian, started calling myself a libertarian, can't remember if it was last year of high school or first year of college. It was somewhere around there. It was a very gradual process. It took me a year to do this. What the principle that really jumps out is early in the Quran, in the canonical order, the second surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the first long surah. The so-called chapters of the Quran are called surahs. And the first one is really short. It's just a prayer. It's the Muslims' all-purpose prayer, Surah Fatiha. It's called a perfect prayer. And it's like, for Muslims, it's what the Lord's Prayer is for Christians. It's a prayer you can say any time or place for any purpose. And then Surah Al-Baqarah begins with the real meat of the Quran. And in this second surah is the following verse, a verse that begins with La ikraha fid din, which means no compulsion in religion, or no coercion in religion. This is a statement of the non-aggression principle, which is the foundational statement of libertarian political theory. All libertarian politics comes out of the statement, and it's phrased in different ways by different groups. The Maryland Libertarian Party, of which I was one time, for a long time, chair, the Maryland Libertarian Party, in their constitution, articulates the non-aggression principle as follows. No person or group has the right to initiate force or fraud against any other person or group to seek to attain their values. Now, the Quranic principle that there must be no compulsion in religion is equivalent to the non-aggression principle when you realize that the word used for religion here is deen. There are several words in Arabic that mean religion, but the word deen has different connotations than the others. For example, one could say iman to mean religion. Iman means like belief. You can use it to refer to the particular creed that you adhere to, or to the strength of your belief. Or you could say millah, which means religious community. So that, the Jews are the community of Moses, and the Christians the community of Jesus, the Muslims the community of Muhammad, and so on. But deen means a way of life. It means, it's a word that if you look at an Arabic thesaurus, deen will be right next to adl, which means justice. So deen is about justice, not just about beliefs or about religious affiliations. It's about doing the right thing. So that means that when the Quran says no coercion in the deen, it's saying no coercion in your way of life. It's not just you can't force someone to become a Muslim, although you obviously can't do that. That's one of the corollaries. But the statement is much more encompassing than that. So if there must be no coercion in your way of life, it is tantamount to the libertarian principle. Now, Muslims, as I say, look to the Quran, but they also look to the practice of the Prophet. And it's interesting that the Prophet was not just a shepherd, although he spent a period being a shepherd like all the other prophets did, nor was he just a businessman, and I'll talk about that later, but in fact, in his adult life, he was primarily a merchant, until he got the call of prophethood, and that makes him not unique among the prophets. Abraham was also a merchant, a businessman, but it's different from most of the prophets. But he was also a political leader, and that puts him in a unique position, because then we can look at how did he lead his community and understand how he applied the general principles of the Quran to his day and time. Now that doesn't mean, as some Muslims think, that, well, we just imitate his city-state, and that's the political system of Islam. No, because he is put forward to us as an example, and we have to understand what the word example means. Those people who simply want to blindly imitate what the Prophet did, I say, don't understand what the word example means. They're like children who are taking a course in arithmetic. Read the chapter about addition, and then they're given an example. The example says 6 plus 6 is 12. And then on the final exam, they're asked, what's 8 plus 7? And they say 12. You say, wrong. So, what do you mean wrong? That was the example in the book. An example is contextualized. It helps you to understand how a principle applies, but it doesn't give you the answer. So, we can look at the example of the Prophet, and it's interesting that he set up the city-state of Medina by writing a compact for its governance. And while that compact, I think, falls short of the first constitution in history, which some people have tried to call it, it's not quite that. But nonetheless, it's a very fascinating document for how it implements Quranic principles in the life of the city-state of Medina, and has much to teach us. One of the most amazing things about this compact is that it refers to, it gives everybody in the city-state the same rights and duties, regardless of whether they're Muslims or not. One has to remember that Medina was not a strictly Muslim community. There were many Jews. There were a handful of people who had not yet converted to Islam. And yet the Quran says that it refers to all of the monotheists, primarily the Jews and Muslims. There were not many Christians in that part of Arabia at that time. But it refers to the Jews and the Christian, the Jews and Muslim citizens of Medina as believers. But more importantly, it requires of them the same duties and gives them the same rights. And most interestingly, embodies a form of pluralism in that it says that the Jews, specifically the Jews, will be ruled by their own law. So they will not be forced to follow Muslim law. Now, of course, Jewish law and Muslim law overlaps quite heavily, but there are some differences that could be problematical, even in that time. An example would be Muslims are not allowed to use wine, to drink wine at all, whereas Jews will drink wine in the Seder and at other occasions. And so clearly they are exempted from that prohibition in order to be able to be free to practice their religion. Another interesting thing about how the city was governed was that the Prophet did not try to micromanage everybody's life, but acted as a judge. He was like the supreme judge in the Court of Appeals. He also acted as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and that was important because they were under attack by his people in Mecca who were still subscribing to the pagan religion. Well, I won't go any further into the Medina Compact. If you're interested, if you'll go to our website, minaret.org, and type in Medina, compact or covenant, it will give you a hit on an article that I wrote on this subject and give you a lot of details about that. Instead, I want to turn to the question of development of Islamic law. And by the way, here I want to say that I do not intend to talk for a very long time. I want to leave lots of time for questions because I know that I'm probably not going to be able to predict exactly what's of interest to you. I just want to give you a basis that will provide you with enough knowledge that you can ask intelligent questions about whatever you really want to know. But let's talk about the development of Islamic law. Unlike some other religions, actually, Islam is not the only religion that has a legal system. Judaism has a legal system as well. But how did this law develop? I told you that the Quran has very few legal prescriptions. It's mostly a book of principles, of guidance. It calls itself a book of guidance, not a book of law. And although one can turn to the Prophet as an example, I gave you the reason why you can't simply blindly imitate the Prophet. So how did Islamic law come into being? Well, before I go into the details, let me first talk about a term that you've heard a lot lately, and that is Sharia. And you've heard it used as a synonym for Islamic law. And it is used as a synonym for Islamic law. But the word Sharia doesn't mean law at all. The word Sharia means path or way, and literally means the path to the well. Path to the well. Now, why the concept of the path to the well would be very important to the desert-dwelling Arabs who were the first Muslims should be self-evident. Knowing the path to the well is a matter of life or death. So, but why is it a synonym for the law? To understand that, I think one has to understand the relationship between the law itself, that is to say, the code of justice, the distinction between what is right and what is wrong, which is God-given. And even those who do not believe in God in the West, some of them have believed in a notion of natural law, by which is meant simply that something is right and something else is wrong. There's a correct path and a wrong path, if you will. And that the human challenge is not to decide, to invent what is right and wrong, but to discover what is right and what is wrong. That's the key to understanding Sharia. If we understand Sharia as being the divine law in its natural, whatever it is, state, as given by God, then the effort of human beings to discover that law is like the effort of mapping, say, terrain. The terrain of the earth or the universe is whatever God decreed it to be, and we human beings try to create maps. And those maps can be good ones, or they can be bad ones, they can be adequate or inadequate. But those maps are a human invention trying to make a correspondence in our mental space to the ineffable reality that we can have no direct knowledge of. That effort is known to the Muslim scholars as fiqh, F-I-Q-H, which means jurisprudence. And what's happened is many Muslims have confused the Sharia, the divine right and wrong, with the fiqh, which is human statements or attempts to map out what is right and wrong. Now, these maps are important, but they should never be treated as sacrosanct and not open to question, because maps can be mistaken. Even a good map can be improved. And if the terrain changes, so the Sharia is like knowing whether or not you're on the edge of a cliff, and the fiqh is about whether or not you know you're at the edge of a cliff. So a good scholar is going to help you to attain that knowledge, and a bad one will not. Now, what's interesting about the development of Islamic law, of the fiqh, of the jurisprudence, was that the Muslims in the early stages of Islam, in the early centuries of Islam, understood something that, unfortunately, too many Muslims today do not understand, is that freedom is the best way to arrive at that knowledge. That it's not something that can be imposed. When I hear someone ask the question, as I'm often asked, do I, as a believing Muslim, do I believe in imposing Sharia? I boggle. You know, I'm an astronomer. That's what my Ph.D. is in. And I get the same sinking feeling that I get when if someone were to ask me, which fortunately no one ever has, but if someone were to ask me, do I believe in imposing the law of gravity? You can't impose the law of gravity. The job of a good scientist is not to impose the law of gravity. The job of a good scientist is to explain gravity to other people so that instead of being an obstacle, it can be something that can be helpful to them and help them to achieve things in this life. So similarly, the job of the scholar is not to impose the Sharia on anybody. It's to help people to understand what the Sharia is. The Sharia, like gravity, is something that is to be obeyed, not something to be imposed. So the early scholars were never, ever part of the state. The great historian Goethen, in his book The Jews and Arabs in History, said that the early generations of scholars were a free and independent republic, totally separated from the state. You know, we believe in separation of powers here in America. We want to separate the executive from the legislative from the judicial. But here, the legal scholars were so separated, they weren't even a separate branch of government. They were outside of the government. And this continued to be the case really up until about the 13th century. And those of you, and I invite you, one of the books I'm selling in the back and encourage you to take a look at is Islam and the Discovery of Freedom. And also in my book, it's really about Islamic science. I deal with the same thing, Signs in the Heavens. Is that in those early centuries of Islam is when the Islamic civilization was the premier civilization of the world. When Europe was in the Dark Ages and people were trying to cure diseases by, you know, cutting people's heads open so their spirits would fly out, the Muslims had not only learned the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, but also of the ancient Africans and the Persians and the Hindus, and had mixed them together, vetted them, sorted out what was true from what was false, and invented whole new sciences. When the Europeans had lost all but one of the works of Aristotle, the Muslims had translated all of Aristotle into Arabic and were writing commentaries. And when Europe eventually regains Aristotle, it's from those retranslating those Arabic commentaries into Latin. So that was when Islam really thrived. And that thriving was not just in the scientific area, which is what one of my books is about, but also in the area of human rights. And among those rights was the concept, and maybe premier among those rights, of real innovation in history. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the Muslims were the first people to ever establish a major civilization on the principle that the king is not above the law. I realized this when I attended a lecture by M. Stanton Evans, who tried to give credit to that to the Magna Carta. He said the Magna Carta was original in history because for the first time the nobles said to King John, "You're not above the law. You have to obey the law." And I went up to Evans afterwards and I said, well, you know, that was a notion that the Muslims had practiced, and that it was articulated by the first leader to succeed Muhammad as secular leader of the community. When Muhammad died, a man named Abu Bakr was elected to be the new leader of the community. And in his inauguration address, he said, "I have been elected your Amir." Amir is an Arabic word. It's usually mistranslated as prince. It means commander. "I've been elected your Amir, even though I'm not the best of you. If I give you an order that is consistent with the Quran and the practice of the Prophet, then you should obey me. And if I give you an order that departs from the Quran or the practice of the Prophet, you should correct me, because truth is righteousness and falsehood is treason. I'm waiting for someone to show me anyone earlier in history, a leader, head of state, who said anything other than disobeying his orders was treason. Here you have a head of state saying, if I do something wrong and you don't tell me, you're guilty of treason. Now, I said to Evans, I think you ought to bear in mind that those nobles who forced the law on King John had just come back from the Crusades, where they had witnessed Saladin, as he's known in the West. And if you look at Western literature, despite the fact that Saladin was this great enemy of the West, they glorify him as a leader, as a man who, even though he could be very tough and even cruel at times, still had this overriding belief that he had to be just. Where do you think these nobles got this idea that the king is not above the law, but that they saw a king who believed it himself? And they went back to King John and said, we're not going to have any more what you've done in the past. From now on, you also are going to be subject to the law. Not to the Sharia, but to the English common law as they believed it to exist. Now, so how do Muslims then, how did these Muslims deal with formulating these legal comments? Well, they relied on 4 sources of the law. The Quran, obviously. The practice of the Prophet, which was known to them through the Hadith. Now, the Hadith is not the same thing as the Sunnah or the practice of the Prophet, but it's how you know what the Prophet did. We have to rely on historical sources. And knowing that historical sources can be unreliable, they developed an entire science of proper citation. And the early compilers of Hadith, who lived 100, 200 years after the time of the Prophet, sort of like the people who canonized the Bible, a couple of hundred years after the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, these people did not want to have errors creeping into this body of knowledge. So they would engage in various developed techniques for verifying and vetting the stories about what the Prophet did or said. And they would classify Hadith as weak or strong. But most interestingly, they would insist that there had to be citation. Anyone who said 200 years after the Prophet said so-and-so, or the Prophet did so-and-so, was asked, how do you know that? And if they would say, well, so-and-so told me, say, how does he know that? Well, so-and-so told him. How does she know that? Well, and to get a chain going from the immediate reporter back to a companion of the Prophet, and then they would write biographies of the people in the chain to see, are these people who had good memories? Are they people who were known to be honest? When you say A heard it from B, are these people who even conceivably could have met? And so on and so forth. So this became an entire science of proper citation. And I don't think if you look earlier in history, you're going to find that kind of citation followed. If you look at the great Greek historian Herodotus, he doesn't cite his sources except in the most vague way. He says, some sailors told me. Who were these sailors? Why should we believe that? We don't know. Take my word for it. So there's the Quran, there's the Hadith, and then there's something called Ijma'. Ijma' means consensus. And this itself is based on a Hadith that the Prophet said, my community will never agree to an error. And so the idea is that if all the Muslims agree to something, it becomes part of the law. Now, there is a dispute among the scholars as to whether this requires consensus of the scholars or consensus of the whole community. a consensus once established can be broken at a later time. All kinds of little wrinkles in this. I'm not going to go into them. But as you can see, this idea of consensus does point in the direction of a democratization of Islamic law, despite the fact it's not really democratic. It's nomocratic. It's rule of law rather than ruled by people. But if everybody agrees to something, then the community is bound to it. And then finally, there was a source called ijtihad. Now, this word ijtihad comes from the same root as jihad, a word I know you've heard, although you may not actually know what it means. Jihad means to struggle. And ijtihad refers to the struggle of a scholar to understand. So the struggle of the individual scholar to come to a conclusion is one of the sources of Islamic law. And again, this is justified by reference to a hadith in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said that if a scholar tries to understand the law and he fails to get the right conclusion, he comes to a wrong conclusion, he gets a blessing anyway for the effort. And if he reaches the right conclusion, he will get 2 blessings. Now, unfortunately, ijtihad was never liked by Islamic rulers. Remember that the scholars were not part of the ruling establishment. They were outsiders. And the scholars were more often than not critical of the rulers, claiming that they had gone outside what was permissible by the law in their rules and regulations and decrees. And they didn't like this because the scholars had a lot of influence in the community and made it very hard for them to govern. And they wished the scholars would just shut up. And they kept trying to claim that the door to ijtihad should be closed. Gradually, sometime between the 12th and the 16th century, the door to ijtihad was effectively closed in that the scholars who in the early days resisted attempts to co-opt them. There are 4 great schools of Sunni thought. Abu Hanifa, the founder of one of them, was arrested by the Sultan for refusing to accept a judgeship. Imam Malik, founder of another one of the great schools, spurned an offer by the ruler, by the Khalifa, so-called the Caliph, to make his book of law the only official book of Islamic law, saying he did not approve of that, and he was being denied the criticism of his peers. Ibn Hanbal was not only arrested, founder of yet another school, was not only arrested but tortured by the ruler. So they've all resisted attempts to being co-opted until about the 12th century, when the Mongols came in and took over the whole eastern part of the Muslim world, and they began to appoint official scholars. And those scholars would just rubber stamp whatever the ruler wanted, and understandably the scholars lost the status they had held in the eyes of the people, and the people pretty much began to think that there was nobody worthy of engaging in ijtihad anymore. And eventually blind imitation began to follow ijtihad. Now in the modern era, there's been an attempt to resuscitate ijtihad, and I will talk about that. But first, I want to talk about how the scholars addressed the decisions they had to make about current issues that were brought to them. And what they appealed to was something called the maqasid al-sharia. Maqasid al-sharia, sharia, you know what that means now. Maqasid means the higher objectives. So they would say, what are the higher objectives of the law? And by understanding this, you would then understand how to address a particular issue that was question that was brought to you, legal question. And they identified, the classical scholars agreed on 5 maqasid. One was the right to life. And their argument is pretty straightforward. Anyone who believes in the right to life follows pretty much the same argument. If you don't have life, you don't have anything else. and therefore it's got to be fundamental, and it's got to be a primary. So there is a right to life. They also identified the right to religion. And this is very consistent with the, not only the Islamic view of the importance of religion, but also the Quranic view of non-coercion, that people should be free to accept whatever religion seems correct to them. They also believed in the right to the intellect. Now, the right to the intellect is a rich notion, and it includes and subsumes a lot of other rights we talk about today, like freedom of expression, freedom of belief, and so on. And the reasoning for this was also pretty straightforward, if you think about it, and that is that by his nature, man requires the mind to survive. So for man, the right to life doesn't mean anything unless man has the right to think. And therefore, the right to think has to be respected for human beings. Another one they discovered was the right to lineage or family. And again, when we go beyond those things that a human being needs to individually sustain himself, and we look at socially what we need, obviously the family is the fundamental unit of human organization. And therefore it has to be respected and defended. And finally, the right to property. And again, if you think about it, the reasoning is quite straightforward and very clear. The nature of human beings, although Muslims believe that human beings are the breath of God, we are spiritual, but we're also material. We need material sustenance to survive. And that is enabled in human society through the mechanism of property, by which we are able to not only possess the things that will sustain us, but to trade them with other people in order to mutually benefit, so that both sides will be better off than they were previous to the trade, and to organize ourselves in order to improve productivity that brings up the benefits of the entire society. So these were the 5 fundamentals. Now, these 5 fundamentals, if we compare them with the much later writing of John Locke, life, liberty, and property, I would say, well, 2 of them are identical, life and property, and the other one, Locke's liberty, I think, is just a kind of overarching concept that includes the others and maybe some more. Now, what's interesting about Islamic scholars in treating this is the early scholars, the classical era scholars, did not refer to these as the rights of man. That's just something that modern scholars have done, probably influenced by Locke and other Western writers. They didn't call them the rights of man. They called them, curiously, the rights of worship, as opposed to the rights of God. Now that may seem very strange at first thought, but if you think about it in the context of what I've said before, it actually makes sense. You see, the rights of God are that God has the right to be worshipped by mankind, and so on. Whereas the rights of worship, how do we worship God? How do we serve God? Remember, worship and service are almost identical in Arabic. How do we serve God? By serving mankind. And so, the way that you're going to serve mankind, and therefore serve God, and therefore your right of worship, is by implementing and respecting these principles. And the duty of the Islamic State is to ensure that these rights are protected. Okay, sounds pretty good, at least to an audience like this it sounds pretty good. I'm sure a statist audience might have problems with what I said, but I'm not dealing with that at the moment. But then it leads us to the question of, okay, so what went wrong? Look at the Muslim world today. This is not what I see. Yes, if you look at the book originally by Rose Wilder Lane, but which I annotated, Islamic Discovery of Freedom, there was a lot of good stuff going on for hundreds of years. But in the last few hundred years, the Islamic world has been pretty pitiful, stagnant at best, and maybe something much worse. So why? What went wrong? Well, there are a lot of theories that are put forward. I'm not going to get into them all because I want to leave time for questions. I will only give you my theory, which is it was because of the decline of ijtihad. That when original thought fell out of favor, that not only did the Muslim society lose the flexibility in the legal system to deal with the issues that it had to deal with, like the rise of the West, but it also lost a model by which the other sciences, other than the legal sciences, could be inspired. If there wasn't original thinking in the legal sciences, then there wouldn't be original thinking in the hard sciences, the social sciences, or in the arts for that matter. People would begin to adopt the mindset because it affected the educational system. The educational system in the Muslim world today is one that glorifies memorization. The concept of a good student is someone who can memorize a lot. But memorization of facts is not education. And you are not a learned person. You're certainly not a scholar because you can memorize a lot of facts. The fact is that human beings can look stuff up. Someone who can think very clearly but has a poor memory is in a better position because he can find stuff quickly. He can get on the internet nowadays, and in a matter of a few minutes, by clear thinking, he can locate the fact that he forgot. While someone who remembers the facts but has no idea what to do with them is not going to be of benefit to himself or his society. So that's my explanation. And that leaves the final point I wanted to address, which is the modern issues that the Muslim world has got to deal with. In my book, Signs in the Heavens, one of the things, I talk about the 7 principles that are taught by Islam that allowed Muslim science to flourish. And obviously, academic freedom is one of them. Good citation is another. But the willingness to question and to challenge what went before, the understanding that went before, is one of the essential things. And it has had an impact on just about every aspect of Muslim life. Because a lot of Muslims like to blame Western imperialism for their status. And in a superficial sense, it's true, but only in a superficial sense. And I'll give you one really, I think, powerful example. If we look at the status of divorce law for women in Egypt, I'm going to be really specific here. In the 1990s, there was a huge debate in Egypt about whether women had a right to initiate divorce. In Islam, divorce is permissible, although intensely disliked. But clearly, men have always been recognized to have a right to divorce. What about women? An attempt to give women the right to initiate divorce meant a lot of resistance from people who said this was un-Islamic. But their thought that it's un-Islamic came from a really short memory. Because it had been banned in Egypt, it had been illegal in Egypt for only about a century. A little bit more. And sociologists, going back to when Egypt was ruled not by Britain, but by the Ottomans, and looking in the court records, found the following fascinating fact. Every single petition for divorce by a woman brought to the Ottoman court in Egypt, with no exceptions, was granted. Every single one. It was the British, with their Victorian era morals, who came in and said, what? Women can initiate a divorce in Islamic law? Oh, that's terrible, terrible, barbaric. The family is the fundamental unit of society. We've got to protect these poor people from their terrible ways. And we'll just remove it. And then people raised in a society where it was illegal, but proud of being Muslims, just assumed, well, this is Islam. But it's not Islam. And the work of these sociologists, combined with the rise of women's halakha circles, women who studied the Quran in a group of just women and discussed it among themselves, discovered the Islamic concept of khula, divorce. It's long been known how a man can divorce his wife. But the question is, how does a woman divorce her husband? And it's actually in the Quran. All a woman has to do, because when a couple gets married, a man has to give the bride a gift. And it's given in two parts because most young people getting married don't have a lot of money. So they give one part immediately and the other part is payable upon either death or divorce. A woman, so if a man divorces his wife, he has to he has to pay off the rest of the gift. If a wife wants to divorce the husband, she has to remit the part of the gift she's already gotten. That's all. Give him his money back and throw him out. Well, they'd completely forgotten this. And once they rediscovered it, it did not take long. It was amazing how quickly the debate in Egypt changed direction and the divorce law was changed. Well, there are lots of other examples I could go into, but I'm not going to go into because it's going to cut into the precious little time we have for Q&A. So I'm simply going to stop here and ask you to go ahead and just ask me whatever you'd like to ask. Yes?
Weren't all these decisions of women being divorced in the writing somewhere?
Mm-hmm. It was, but nobody looked it up. It was there. The Ottomans were bureaucrats, and they were real good about writing down every detail. But the modern Egyptians, who are civil servants, they didn't do that kind of research. They just assumed this is the way the law books say we do it now. This is the way it's been back to the time of the prophet. And it took, there were not, if you looked in Egyptian society, there aren't many Egyptian sociologists. If you're an Egyptian in the time of Nasser, and you wanted to get ahead, you became a government employee. You did not become a university professor.
If you wanted to live.
Well, not necessarily. You could become a university professor, but you couldn't be a very good one. If you became a university professor who said, hey, you know what, I've done some research and our laws are all contradictory to the past 1,000 years of Islamic jurisprudence, you were in deep danger, yeah. So that's something that's been changing and hopefully will continue to change, but we're still at an early stage. To this day, one of the problems with Muslim parents who want their kids to get ahead, forget about Egypt, even in the United States, way too many parents want their kids to become engineers or doctors. Because to them, that's something with status. If someone says, I want to study religious law, I want to study the history of the Sharia, they would say, what, you want to be like an imam in some little, country mosque? What's the matter with you? You've got no ambition. That's not what we want our kid to be. Let alone, a human rights lawyer or a sociologist or an astrophysicist. I mean, I'm one of the very few people, Muslims, who has a Ph.D. in astrophysics. And the reason I'm sure is because pressure from parents, like, what is that? What kind of field is that to pursue? I'm not going to make it money that way. Yeah.
We hear both that as non-Muslims in this country, we hear that Muslims wish to impose Sharia law, which of course you've dispelled all of that, and something about the caliphate. Can you talk to that?
Right. Okay, well the caliphate, as I said, although the word Khalifa in the Quran means man is God's agent on earth, nonetheless, very soon after the election of Abu Bakr, people began to refer to the what Abu Bakr called the Amir, the commander, as the Khalifa, as if the head of state is God's appointed agent on earth. Now, why the heads of state like that, I don't have to explain. That's self-evident. It was the Muslim version of the divine right of kings. But it was totally unjustified from a religious point of view. I'm sorry, I lost the thread of my thoughts. Say the question again?
The caliphate.
Oh. But there was continuously a caliphate from the four early from the early emirate, the four what they're called the Khulafa Rashidun, the righteous scholars. And then came the unrighteous scholars from that time forward to the beginning of the 20th century. But there was always at least one Khalifa, head of state of the Muslim world. Even though later years he wasn't really the head of state, the Sultan was the head of state, but the Khalifa was just symbolic. Up until 1924. By that time, the Ottomans were the premier Muslim empire, and so the Caliphate was located in Turkey. When the Turks sided with the losing side in World War I, the Turks were very much concerned about the Europeans coming in and taking over Turkey, and therefore they decided that one of them, a man named Mustafa Kemal, who gave himself the name Ataturk, father of the Turks, decided that he himself single-handedly would bring Turkey into the modern age, and that he would do it, and it was necessary. In order to do that, it was necessary to abolish the Caliphate. He did not want to take it over, because as long as there was a Khalifa in Turkey, the rest of the Muslim world would be too interested in what he was doing, and he wanted a totally free hand. He was a dictator, and he wanted to be able to conduct his dictatorial activities without interest of other Muslims. And so he abolished the Caliphate, forcibly turned Turkey into, it was supposed to be a republic, but it was an undemocratic republic. He basically controlled everything. And he did his best to push Islam out of public life and to push a knowledge of Islam out of the minds of his citizens, going to the extreme of reforming the language, including getting rid of the Arabic script that Turks used and replacing it with Latin letters, so that young Turks being taught how to read would easily be able to read European literature, but no longer able to read the Quran. So what's happened is that some Muslims have tried to blame the status of the Muslims in the 20th century on the loss of the Caliphate. These are people with a very shallow understanding of history. The Muslims have been in this state for centuries. It wasn't because we lost, because of the Caliphate, because of our backwardness. The loss of the Caliphate didn't cause the backwardness. But some got it mixed up, most notably a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. And Hizb ut-Tahrir is set on reestablishing a worldwide Islamic Caliphate. The thing is that the terrorists, who we are constantly told want to establish an Islamic Caliphate, actually do not have that as a primary goal. Some of them may want to do that, but that's not why they're fighting. The terrorists are interested in something else. They're interested in getting rid of the current rulers in their countries, who they call the near enemy. And they view the West as the far enemy, the people who are responsible for setting up those dictators. So, yes?
You talk about when you took away the separation of church and state, which is really what you refer to when you say that the scholars were not part of the republic at all. They were totally separate from the church and state. When that went away is when the downslide of the whole Middle East, the whole Arab culture happened, because the state effectively took over the ruling of everything.
Well, again, I think it's, what you say is true. I would call it a secondary cause. The primary cause being the abandonment of original thinking. But
well, that's the primary cause of what, I mean, that's the primary result of when you stop original thinking happening external to the government.
But I don't think, but I don't,
effect.
well, I think if the Islamic society at that point in history had the respect for original thinking that it had earlier on, I don't think that the state would have succeeded. For example, the biggest change was the conquest of the eastern half of the Muslim world by the Mongols.
Right.
But why was that possible? The Muslims had successfully not only resisted imperial efforts to take them over, but pushed back so forcibly that Islam rapidly expanded from Arabia until it covered from Spain to India. Now, what made them such good fighters? As fierce as Arab Bedouin fighters may be in their desert warfare, that doesn't explain their taking over Byzantium and the Persian Empire.
But also, once it expanded, you diluted the talent pool.
Well, I guess here's where I have to mention Ibn Khaldun. One of the greatest historians in Muslim history, and the man who was called the Father of Sociology, by another famous Western sociologist whose name is escaping me at the moment. Ibn Khaldun was going to write a history of the world. And he was going to, and in those days, an author was expected to write an introduction to his books. The introduction could be a few paragraphs or a few pages normally. It's called a Muqaddimah. And Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah turned out to be 3 volumes. And the reason was that he said that he had discovered something nobody else ever seemed to notice before. And that was that history follows cycles. And that dynasties, indeed civilizations, rise and fall. And he said they seem to have the seeds of their own destruction in their rise. They're like an organic thing. And he says in particular what happens is that every civilization seems to be set up by people of what he called Bedouin inclinations. By Bedouin inclinations, he meant people who had no taste for luxury. They have a strong sense of what he called asabiyya, which means social solidarity. They do what they think is good for their group. And therefore they institute sound policies. And those sound policies make their society very successful. But in the second and third and fourth generations, as the leaders get further and further removed from those policies that made them successful, the government becomes so rich, the rulers become so used to handing out favors, they begin to think the purpose of government is to hand out favors rather than to have the sound policies that make the society successful in the first place. And thus, the society begins to unravel. And he said, this happens over and over and over again in history.
And we're witnessing it right now.
Yeah, right. And of course, you know, and here's another interesting thing. He says a really good civilization, a really good dynasty, can last about 200 years before this happens. And that number will be very meaningful to this group. Yeah.
Now, I've read that there were issues related to Second Amendment issues with Islamic culture that non-Muslims were not allowed to be armed. Is that actually part of religious law or what?
Well, what it boils down to is this. There was a problem. I told you in the Medina Compact, all the citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim, had the same rights and responsibilities, including the duty to defend the state from attack. And what happened is that the 3 Jewish tribes, one by one, violated their agreements and sided with the invading pagans, the polytheists. And so, subsequently, the Muslims adopted a concept of a protected minority, so that instead of being a full citizen, a non-Muslim group would be a protected minority, entitled to the full protection of the state, including freedom of religion, but not required to defend the state. They did not have standing armies like we have today. They had militias. And if you were armed, you were expected to serve in the militia. Therefore, the armed groups were the Muslim groups. Now, there were exceptions made. It's interesting that in a negotiation between a minority group and the Muslim ruler, if a minority group really, really wanted to defend the state and wanted to be held responsible for fulfilling its obligations to do so, it, in fact, could be subject to membership in the militia. There's nothing in Islamic law that says that people couldn't be armed for personal protection. And that's something that in Islamic history, I think, just happens under a few really, really crazy and oppressive rulers, like his name Hakim of Egypt. I don't think that that was the rule. So they were making the distinction between, to use modern terminology, between a handgun and an assault rifle. So, you know, if you were a minority, you could have your handgun to protect yourself, but